There is a girl crying in the middle of a classroom. She is 17. She is holding a worn backpack against her chest like it is the last solid thing in the world. Her shoulders are turned inward, her face buried in her hands, and around her the room has gone completely, unnaturally still, the particular stillness of 30 people who have just realized they are witnesses to something they cannot take back. In the doorway, a man in a dark suit stands without moving. Silver-haired, jaw set, eyes traveling the room with the slow, deliberate patience of someone conducting an inventory, cataloging faces, reading the architecture of what happened here, filing everything away with the cold precision of a man who has spent 30 years deciding what things cost and who pays. His gaze lands on Preston Montgomery. And Preston, who has never once in 17 years been made to feel small, feels it. Feels the blood leave his face. Feels the floor shift beneath the particular arrogance he has always stood on so comfortably. The man at the door has not spoken a single word. He doesn't need to. The room already knows. 24 hours earlier, a girl with a worn backpack walked into Westbrook Academy and made the mistake of being visible. It was Preston who would pay for it. The car stopped half a block from the school. Claire had asked the driver to do that. She always did. She stepped out onto the pavement, adjusted the straps of her backpack, and stood for a moment watching Westbrook Academy the way a soldier watches a battlefield they've crossed before. Not with fear, exactly, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who already knows how this goes. The building was beautiful, of course. They were always beautiful. Red brick, tall windows, a crest above the entrance that implied centuries of excellence. Wealth dressed up as tradition. She had seen 6 versions of this same building in 4 years. She started walking. The backpack was her system. She had developed it after the 3rd school, after she'd arrived in a car that cost more than some teachers' annual salaries and watched the entire social ecosystem reorganize itself around her before she'd even found her locker. People performed around money. They smiled differently, laughed louder, crowded closer. And then, when they eventually discovered she was just a quiet girl with no interest in their performance, the resentment came. It always came. So now she arrived like this. Worn bag. Plain shoes. Mid-semester, when the social hierarchies were already calcified and a new face was unremarkable. She would find her level. She would observe. She would decide quietly and without announcing it to anyone whether this place was worth staying. She had never, in 4 schools, decided to stay. She found the classroom without asking for directions. She'd studied the building map the night before and slipped through the door just as the bell finished ringing. The room was already full and already loud, that particular pre-lesson noise of 30 teenagers pretending the lesson hasn't started. Claire moved fast, head down, eyes already on the back row. Second seat from the wall. Empty. She crossed to it, sat down, and pulled her backpack onto her lap. She exhaled. 4 minutes, she thought. Just give me 4 minutes. She used those 4 minutes the way she always did, studying the room without appearing to. She catalogued the social architecture quickly, efficiently. The loud cluster near the windows who didn't need to perform because their dominance was assumed, the middle rows of kids who laughed just a half second after everyone else, the 2 girls near the front who sat together like a fortress of 2. Standard. Familiar. She'd mapped variations of this room in Edinburgh, in Geneva, in Singapore. Then she found the one that was different. He sat in the 3rd row, slightly turned in his seat, already watching her. Not with the dull curiosity most people gave new students, but with something sharper, more deliberate. He was the kind of handsome that had learned early it was a weapon. Jaw set. Easy in his chair. Blue eyes moving over her with the slow, systematic confidence of someone conducting an assessment and already arriving at a verdict. Claire looked away first. Not because she was afraid. Because she recognized the type. and engaging was never worth it. She was wrong to think it wouldn't happen anyway. The lesson had been running for 20 minutes when Mr. Calloway, the English teacher, asked the class to introduce the new student. It was the thing Claire dreaded most. The ritual exposure. "Claire," Mr. Calloway said, consulting his register, "would you like to tell the class a little about yourself?" She would not. But she stood anyway, because refusing made it worse, and said her name quietly and sat back down in under 4 seconds. She heard a muffled laugh from the third row. She kept her eyes on her desk. What she did not see, could not see, was Mr. Calloway watching her from the front of the room with a small, troubled frown creasing his forehead. He had been teaching for 19 years. He had seen shy students, anxious students, students performing confidence they didn't feel. He knew every version of a teenager trying to disappear. But this was different. This girl wasn't hiding because she was afraid. She was hiding because she had chosen to. Every detail, the bag, the seat, the 4-second introduction, was deliberate, practiced. This was not anxiety. This was strategy. And in his 19 years, only one kind of student arrived at a school with that level of premeditated invisibility. The kind who had something significant to hide. He was still thinking about it when Preston Montgomery turned around in his seat, looked at the quiet girl in the back row, and opened his mouth. And Mr. Calloway, who had spent 19 years knowing when to intervene, moved 1 second too late. There was a specific kind of power that Preston Montgomery had, and it had nothing to do with money. His father had money. Half the parents at Westbrook had money. Money was ambient here, in the blazers, in the cars lining the drop-off lane, in the way the cafeteria served 3 kinds of sparkling water without anyone thinking it was unusual. Money was the water they all swam in. It was unremarkable. What Preston had was different. Preston had authority. The social kind, the kind that doesn't get issued or inherited but accumulates, slowly, from 1,000 small moments where someone could have pushed back and didn't. A teacher who laughed at a joke that wasn't quite appropriate. A principal who framed a complaint as a misunderstanding. A vice principal who called Preston's father before calling anyone else, as a courtesy, as a habit, as the path of least resistance. Authority built not from one dramatic moment but from years of the world quietly, consistently, rearranging itself so that Preston Montgomery never had to feel uncomfortable. He had understood this about himself since he was 14. And he had been, in the 3 years since, both student and architect of his own mythology. By junior year, his social orbit had the gravitational pull of something much larger than a 17-year-old boy. There was Marcus, his second, big, loyal, laughed loudest at every joke, had not formed an independent opinion since freshman orientation. There was Jade, who was sharp enough to have her own dominance but had calculated, correctly, that alliance with Preston was more efficient than competition. There were the outer ring followers who laughed a half-beat after Marcus, who repeated Preston's observations as their own at different lunch tables, who had built their entire social identity on the proximity. And then there were the teachers. Not all of them. Mr. Calloway, for instance, had a way of looking at Preston that was professionally neutral in a manner that Preston found quietly irritating. The look of a man who had clocked him completely and was simply choosing his battles. Preston didn't like that look. He preferred the other kind. Ms. Devereux, who taught history, had that other kind. She laughed at his comments, called him sharp, once described him to a colleague, not knowing he was around the corner, knowing full well he was around the corner, as one of those students who could run the world someday. Preston had filed that away. He filed everything away. The administration operated on a simpler principle. Preston's father sat on the school's development board. His family's name was on the new science wing. When complaints arrived, and they had, twice in formal writing, They were addressed with the careful language of institutions that have confused management with justice. Handled. Resolved. A learning moment for all involved. The complainants transferred within a semester. Preston remained. This was the ecosystem into which Claire Sterling had arrived with her worn backpack and her strategy of invisibility. She had read the room Claire had. She was good at reading rooms. But there were things you couldn't read from the back row in 20 minutes. You couldn't read the 3 years of infrastructure. You couldn't read the unspoken agreement between a boy and an institution that had decided, somewhere along the way, that keeping him comfortable was easier than holding him accountable. She didn't know what she had walked into. Preston, for his part, had already moved on. That was the thing about his cruelty. It wasn't personal. It was almost worse that it wasn't personal. Claire was simply the easiest available target on a Tuesday morning when he was slightly bored and the lesson hadn't started yet. By lunch, he would barely remember her name. By Friday, she would be a footnote, one of those moments his followers referenced occasionally as shorthand for his wit. Remember what he said to that transfer girl, already fossilizing into legend. He was explaining this exact dynamic to Marcus after class, not in those words, in cruder and more comfortable ones, when his phone buzzed. A text from his father. He glanced at it, bored, expecting the usual. A schedule conflict. A reminder about the weekend. His father communicated in logistical fragments, efficient and impersonal. But this text was 3 sentences long. Preston read it once. Then again. Then he looked up slowly, his easy expression doing something it almost never did. Shifting. He typed back a single question. The reply came in under 10 seconds. And Preston Montgomery, king of Westbrook Academy, felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. It felt uncomfortably close to fear. It started with a look. That was how it always started with Preston. Not with words. Words came second. First came the look, that slow, deliberate turn in his seat, the gaze traveling with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once been told that staring is rude. He had done it to Claire briefly when she arrived. That was the preview. What happened 20 minutes into Mr. Calloway's lesson on narrative voice was the full performance. Mr. Calloway had made the mistake of stepping into the hallway. 30 seconds. Maybe less. A colleague with a question, a hand raised outside the door, the brief and fatal calculation of a teacher who believed, in that moment, that 19 years of classroom management meant his room could hold itself together for half a minute. The door had not fully closed before Preston turned around. He didn't say anything immediately. He let the silence do the first work, let it draw eyes, let the room recalibrate toward him the way it always did, effortlessly, like water finding its level. Marcus straightened slightly in his seat. Jade glanced over with the faint smile of someone settling in for entertainment. The middle rows stilled. Preston's gaze landed on Claire. She felt it before she saw it. That particular quality of attention. Heavy, deliberate, carrying intent. She looked up from her notebook and found him already fully turned, arm draped over the back of his chair, studying her with an expression of theatrical curiosity that had the whole room as its audience. "So," he said, conversational, almost friendly. "Where exactly did you transfer from?" Claire held his gaze for one measured second. "Another school," she said, and looked back down. The room flickered with surprised appreciation. A few people glanced at Preston to see how he'd take it. He smiled. If anything, the deflection delighted him. It made it interesting. "Another school," he repeated, tasting the words. "Right. And did that school have a uniform policy or—" His gaze dropped pointedly to her backpack, sitting on the desk beside her, worn canvas and fraying straps and the general aesthetic of something rescued rather than purchased. Was it also more of a freestyle situation? The laugh came from Marcus first. Then it spread, not universal but enough. The particular, terrible laugh of a room that has decided participation is safer than silence. Claire's hands moved to the straps of her backpack. She did not look up. Preston read her stillness as permission to continue. He always read stillness that way. "I'm serious," he said, performing sincerity now, which was somehow worse. "I just want to understand the vibe. Because you've got the bag of someone doing a gap year in a developing country, and you're sitting in the back like you're trying to be part of the wall, and I'm genuinely curious." He paused, letting the room lean in. "Are you actually enrolled here, or did you just wander in from the street and no one's noticed yet?" The laugh was louder this time. Someone in the middle row made a sound that was half laugh, half wince. Jade didn't laugh. She watched Claire instead, with an expression that was hard to read. But the damage was the laughter itself, the way it filled the room and made the air feel smaller, the way it turned 30 individuals into a single, thoughtless thing. Claire's knuckles had gone white on the straps. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were fixed on a point on her desk, not downcast, not defeated, but focused, the way someone looks when they are applying every available unit of self-control to a single purpose. She would not give him her face. She would not give him her tears. Not here. Not in front of this room that had just decided, in the space of 45 seconds, that she was available to be laughed at. She had survived this before. She could survive it again. What she was not prepared for was what happened next. Because Preston, apparently unsatisfied with her silence, reached across the aisle, casually, almost lazily, and flicked the tag on her backpack. The small white manufacturer's tag that she had never bothered to remove. He read the brand name aloud. Then the price, which was printed in faded ink just below it. The room went sharp and quiet. Someone exhaled a stunned laugh. And in that moment, the classroom door opened. But it was not Mr. Calloway. The person standing in the doorway was someone none of them had ever seen before. A woman from the administrative office, expression tight, a piece of paper in her hand. She looked at the room. She looked at Claire. She looked at Preston. "Claire Sterling," she said. "The principal would like to see you." She paused. "And your emergency contact has already been notified." She made it to the bathroom before her hands started shaking. That was the rule she had developed somewhere between the second school and the third. You do not let them see it. You do not give the room the satisfaction of watching something land. You hold it, the way you hold your breath underwater, for however long it takes to get somewhere private. And then, and only then, do you let yourself feel it. She pushed through the bathroom door, checked the stalls, empty, and stood at the sink with both hands gripping the cold porcelain, staring at her own face in the mirror. She looked the same. That was always the strange part. She looked completely the same. The shaking moved from her hands up through her arms. She turned on the cold tap and pressed her wrists under the water, an old trick, something that slowed the body down when the mind had gotten too loud. She focused on the sensation. Cold. Real. Present. "You've survived worse," she told herself. "You've survived Edinburgh. You've survived Geneva. You've survived the girl in Singapore who told the entire grade about your mother's name and watched you navigate a week of strangers performing sympathy at you like it was a sport. This was a boy with a sharp mouth and a room full of people who needed someone to laugh at. This was survivable. But her hands would not stop shaking. Because it wasn't the backpack comment. It wasn't the price tag. God, the price tag, that single casual cruelty that had made the room go quiet in that specific, delighted way that meant it had landed perfectly, that it had done exactly the damage he'd intended. It wasn't even the laughter which she had expected, which she had prepared for in the abstract way you prepare for whether you know is coming. It was the tag itself. Because she knew, logically, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had thought about this more than any teenager should have to, that the backpack was a choice. She had chosen it. She had stood in a store 6 weeks ago and selected it deliberately, this specific bag at this specific price point, because it was part of the system. The system that was supposed to protect her from exactly this, from rooms reorganizing themselves around her, from the particular performance of people who wanted access to what her last name represented. She had built the system carefully. And Preston had walked through it in 45 seconds with nothing but a manufacturer's tag and an audience. She turned off the tap, pressed a paper towel against her face, looked at herself again in the mirror. 7 schools, she thought. I've done 7 versions of this. And then, quieter, the thought she never let herself think for too long. When does it stop? She didn't have an answer. She had never had an answer. What she had, instead, was the thing she did when the question got too heavy to carry alone. She reached into the front pocket of the worn backpack and took out her phone. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the screen. The contact was simply labeled Dad. No photo. She had removed the photo years ago because seeing his face in her phone's contacts while going weeks without hearing his voice had felt like a specific kind of cruelty she could control at least. She had called this number exactly twice in the past 2 years. Once when she'd been sick in Edinburgh and the school nurse had insisted. Once when the logistics of her flight to Singapore needed his signature. This was different. Her thumb hovered. He's in a meeting, she thought. He's always in a meeting. It'll go to his assistant. I'll get a call back from someone named Gregory who will ask me to confirm my date of birth before he passes on the message. She pressed call anyway. It rang once. Twice. On the 3rd ring something happened that had not happened in 2 years. He picked up. Not Gregory. Not voicemail. Not the ambient sound of a meeting being briefly paused. His voice, direct and immediate, slightly rough in the way it got when he had been talking for hours. Claire. Just her name. But the way he said it, like he had been waiting, like some frequency in the single ring had already told him something was wrong, broke something open in her chest that she had been holding shut all morning. She opened her mouth to say I'm fine, to say sorry to bother you, to say the things she had trained herself to say. Instead, what came out was, something happened. Silence on the line. Then the sound she had not heard in 2 years. The sound of a chair moving. Of a man standing up. And then, very quietly, the sound that changed everything. A door closing. He had stepped out of the meeting. For her. And before she could process what that meant, before she could recalibrate everything she had assumed about how much space she took up in his life, she heard him say, low and certain and with a stillness that suddenly reminded her of exactly who her father was. Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. Outside the bathroom door, the hallway had gone unexpectedly quiet. And then she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Stopping just outside the door. And then a voice she recognized. Preston's. I know you're in there, he said. Almost gentle. Almost apologetic. The performance of a boy who had decided, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, that the bathroom door was his next audience. I just wanted to say, no hard feelings. Yeah. It was just a joke. A pause. Also, he added, you might want to tell whoever you called that the principal's already spoken to my dad. He let that land. And my dad, he said, handles things. His footsteps moved away down the hallway. Claire stood motionless, phone still pressed to her ear, her father's voice saying her name from 500 miles away. And somewhere in her chest, something that had been quietly bending for 4 schools and 7 years finally, completely, snapped. The 43rd floor had a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness. The Sterling Industries headquarters was never empty, Not during market hours, not during any hours that Alistair considered worth counting. It was the silence of a place where noise had been architecturally discouraged. Thick glass, deep carpet, the kind of air that felt filtered not just for particles but for anything that might distract from the singular purpose of the building, which was the accumulation and deployment of serious power. Alistair Sterling's corner office sat at the building's northeast apex, floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, the city spread below him like a document he had already read and annotated. He had not chosen the office for the view. He had chosen it because it had two doors, one that opened to his executive floor, one that opened to a private corridor, and because a man in his position needed, at all times, more than one way out of a room. He was on his fourth meeting of the morning when the phone rang. Not the desk phone. Not the work line that Gregory screened with the efficiency of a man whose entire professional identity depended on it. His personal phone. The one with 8 contacts and a ringtone he had never bothered to change from the factory default because the only people who had the number already knew to call it only when it mattered. He glanced at the screen. Claire. Something moved through him. Not quite surprise, not quite alarm, but something adjacent to both. A recalibration. He had learned, in the 2 years since she had stopped calling, to carry her absence as a fixed condition. The way you learn to carry an old injury. Not painlessly, but functionally. You account for it. You build your movements around it. You do not expect it to suddenly announce itself in the middle of a Tuesday morning. He held up one finger to the 4 people seated across from him and picked up the phone. Claire. He heard her breathing first. Then the quality of her silence. Not the silence of someone who had called by accident, but the silence of someone standing at the edge of something and deciding whether to jump. In 30 years of reading rooms, negotiating with governments, and sitting across tables from men who had mastered the art of revealing nothing, Alistair Sterling had developed an almost mechanical sensitivity to the precise weight of silence. What kind it was. What it cost the person holding it. This silence cost his daughter everything she had. Something happened, she said. 2 words. Stripped of preamble, stripped of the careful qualifications she had inherited from him. The "I'm fine and sorry to bother you and it's probably nothing" that he had heard exactly twice in 2 years and had understood, both times, were not true. No qualifications this time. He was already standing. He did not make a production of it. He simply stood, the way a building load bears, the way a foundation responds to pressure, without drama and without hesitation, and looked at the 4 people across the table with the expression that his executive team had learned, over a decade, to read correctly. The meeting was over. They gathered their materials with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that questions were not part of this moment. He waited until the door closed. Then he crossed to the window, phone to his ear, and said, "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." She talked for 4 minutes. He did not interrupt. He did not make the sounds that people make when they are listening performatively, the and right and of course that signal attention without requiring it. He simply listened, standing at the window with one hand in his pocket, watching the city below with the focused stillness of a man processing information he intends to act on. She told him about the classroom, about the backpack, about the price tag read aloud to a laughing room. Her voice was controlled. She was his daughter entirely in that regard. But underneath the control was something raw and exhausted that he recognized because he had put it there. Not maliciously, not deliberately, but through 4 schools and 7 years of absence dressed up as provision. He had given her everything except the one thing that might have made her feel worth protecting. His presence. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then she told him about the hallway, about the footsteps outside the bathroom door, about the boy's voice, almost gentle, telling her that his father handled things. Alistair was quiet for 3 seconds. "What is the boy's name?" She told him. He crossed to his desk. opened his laptop with one hand, typed the name, and in the time it took the search to return results, his expression did something it almost never did in this office, behind this glass, in this city that had spent 30 years deciding he was untouchable. It went very, very still, because he knew that name. He knew the father. He knew the company. He knew the contract, the one sitting in his legal team's queue right now, and signed, worth more to the Montgomery family than anything else on their balance sheet this quarter. He closed the laptop. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Not his office jacket, the other one, the one he wore when he was going somewhere that required a different kind of authority than a boardroom. He pressed the intercom. Gregory. Sir. Clear the afternoon. A pause. Gregory had been his assistant for 11 years and had heard Alistair cancel afternoons exactly 3 times. Each time had preceded something seismic. The Harrington call at 3. Cancel it. Yes, sir. Shall I arrange the car? Alistair was already moving toward the private door, phone still in his hand, his daughter's silence still on the line. I'll drive myself, he said. And Gregory, who had worked for this man for 11 years and prided himself on anticipating everything, found that he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen, which meant, he understood instinctively, that whoever was on the receiving end of it had no idea either. The rumor arrived in the cafeteria at 12:17. That was how it worked at Westbrook. Information didn't travel through announcements or official channels, it moved the way weather moved, building pressure in one place until it had to go somewhere else. By the time most students heard a thing, it had already been filtered through 6 versions of itself, each one slightly more dramatic than the last, each one carrying the particular distortion of people who understood instinctively that a good story was worth more than an accurate one. This one started at the front office. A secretary named Mrs. Paulson, who had worked the Westbrook reception desk for 14 years and had developed in that time an almost clinical detachment from the minor dramas of institutional life, would later tell her colleague that the man had not announced himself. He had simply walked in, through the main entrance, past the security desk, past the student display cases and the framed photographs of alumni and the trophy cabinet that the administration kept aggressively lit, and stood at the reception counter with a patient, absolute stillness of someone who was accustomed to rooms adjusting to them rather than the other way around. He was silver-haired. Dark suit. No tie. He had looked at Mrs. Paulson with calm, pale eyes and said the principal's name. Not the principal but his actual name, first and last. The way you say the name of someone you have already decided is accountable to you, and asked to see him. Mrs. Paulson had asked if he had an appointment. He had looked at her for a moment that she would later describe to her colleague as the longest 3 seconds of my professional life. Then he had said quietly, "Tell him Alistair Sterling is here." She had picked up the phone immediately. She could not have explained afterward exactly why. Only that something in the quality of those 3 words had bypassed every procedural instinct she had developed in 14 years and gone directly to the part of her brain that recognized, without context, without explanation, that the man standing at her counter was not someone who waited. The principal had come out in under 2 minutes. His assistant had seen it from across the office. The way Principal Hargrove's expression changed when Mrs. Paulson relayed the name. The way he had straightened his jacket before opening the door, a small, involuntary adjustment, the kind of thing a person does when they suddenly feel underdressed. He had extended his hand to the silver-haired man and said something that his assistant couldn't hear, but she could read, and what his mouth had formed was unmistakably, "Of course. Please come in." The door had closed. That was all anyone had actually witnessed. A man, a name, a door closing. But by 12:17, the cafeteria had it as a man in a black car who arrived without an appointment and made the principal come out to meet him in the lobby. By 12:22, it was, nobody knows who he is, but Hargrove looked like he'd seen a ghost. By 12:25, It had reached Preston Montgomery's table. He was in the middle of a story, something about the weekend, something that had Marcus laughing with the full-body commitment of someone whose social survival depended on finding the right things funny, when Jade leaned across the table and relayed it, quietly, with the precise economy of someone delivering information rather than gossip. Preston listened, nodded once, returned to his story. He felt nothing. This was not bravado. It was not performed indifference masking genuine unease. Preston Montgomery simply, genuinely, did not connect the dots, did not draw the line between the quiet girl in the back row and a silver-haired man who had made his principal come out to the lobby. The world did not work that way in his experience. Quiet girls with worn backpacks did not have fathers who arrived in black cars. That was not how the hierarchy functioned. He had spent 3 years studying this hierarchy with the dedication of someone whose position within it was his primary achievement, and he understood it, he believed, completely. His father handled things. That was what he'd told the girl through the bathroom door, and he'd meant it, and it was true, and that was the end of it. So he finished his story. Marcus laughed. Jade smiled. And Preston reached for his phone, checked it casually, and found a text from his father. Short. 3 words. He read it once and felt the cafeteria noise fade to a distant hum around him. He read it again. Then he looked up slowly across the cafeteria to where Claire Sterling was sitting alone at a corner table. Not crying, not looking at her phone, not doing anything except sitting very still with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at the door. Like she was waiting for something. Like she already knew it was coming. Preston's phone buzzed again. His father. Calling this time, not texting. He stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before he answered. And the voice on the other end was not the voice of a man who handled things. It was the voice of a man who had just discovered that someone else handled things better. The principal's office smelled like ambition that had stopped growing. Alistair noticed it the moment he sat down, the particular staleness of a room where someone had arranged their achievements so carefully, so completely, that nothing new had entered in years. Framed degrees on the wall. A trophy from a regional academic competition. 2009. Photographs with minor local dignitaries, each one hung at exactly the same height, as if the symmetry might imply significance. Principal Hargrove had built a very convincing display of a life that mattered. Alistair had seen it 1,000 times. Men who confused the performance of authority with the thing itself. Hargrove sat across from him with the careful posture of someone who had spent the walk from the lobby rapidly recalibrating. He was a tall man gone slightly soft, with the practiced warmth of an administrator who had learned that a good handshake and sustained eye contact could navigate most situations. He had deployed both in the lobby. He was deploying them now, along with a specific institutional smile. Understanding, concerned, collaborative, that Alistair recognized as the expression of a man buying time. "Mr. Sterling," Hargrove began, "I want to assure you that we take all student welfare concerns with the utmost." Alistair placed the manila folder on the desk. He did not open it. Not yet. He simply placed it between them, squarely, and let it sit there for a moment the way you let a statement sit before you finished making it. Hargrove's eyes went to it. Came back up. The smile held, but something behind it shifted almost imperceptibly. A door closing somewhere deep in the building of his composure. "I'm not here for assurances," Alistair said. His voice was level. Conversational, almost. "I'm here because my daughter sat in a classroom in this building this morning and was publicly humiliated by a student while a teacher was present, and the institutional response was to send an administrator to collect her from class without addressing the student who did it." Hargrove opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Alistair said. Not unkindly. Simply as a statement of fact. Hargrove closed his mouth. "I've been briefed on the student. Preston Montgomery." He said the name the way you say a variable in an equation, without weight, without emotion, simply as a value to be accounted for. I understand his family has a significant relationship with this institution. I understand that relationship has historically informed how certain situations involving Preston have been managed. He paused. I want you to know that I understand that completely. And I want you to know that it ends today. He opened the folder. The first page was a summary document, clean, professionally formatted, the kind of thing that took a very good legal team about 40 minutes to produce when properly motivated. It outlined the Sterling Industries Foundation's historical giving to secondary educational institutions in the district. The numbers were significant. Hargrove's eyes moved down the column and his expression did the small, involuntary thing that expressions do when a number is larger than expected. He turned to page 2. His face changed. Not dramatically. Hargrove was too practiced for drama. But there was a quality to the change that Alastair had seen before, in boardrooms and courtrooms and across negotiating tables on 4 continents. It was the expression of a person who has just understood the actual dimensions of the room they are standing in and realized it is much smaller than they thought. Page 2 was the Montgomery family. Specifically, it was the architecture of how Montgomery Capital's most significant current revenue stream flowed, indirectly but unmistakably, through a series of contracts and partnership agreements that terminated, ultimately, in Sterling Industries. It was not presented as a threat. There were no threats anywhere in the document. It was presented as information, clean, factual, organized with the serene confidence of someone who knows that the facts, properly arranged, require no embellishment. Hargrove turned to page 3, then 4. By page 5, he had stopped performing the institutional smile entirely. The room was very quiet. Outside the office window, Alastair could see the Westbrook campus. Students moving between buildings, the ordinary choreography of a school day continuing unaware. Somewhere in that building, his daughter was sitting with a coffee she was probably not drinking, waiting. He had made her wait for 2 years. He did not intend to make her wait any longer. I have one ask, Alastair said. One. And it is not a complicated one. Hargrove looked up from the folder. He had the expression of a man who had arrived at work this morning expecting a Tuesday and was only now understanding what kind of day it had actually become. Accountability, Alastair said. Public. Proportionate. Today. Hargrove held his gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone. He did not call his assistant. He did not call the vice principal or the student welfare coordinator or any of the usual machinery of institutional response that existed, Alastair knew, primarily to slow things down and distribute responsibility until it became unlocatable. He called the Montgomerys. And from across the desk, Alastair could hear, faintly, the sound of the phone ringing out. Once. Twice. And then a voice picking up, sharp, already defensive, already performing the confidence of a man who was accustomed to being called by principals and accustomed to those calls going a particular way. Hargrove looked at Alastair across the desk. And for the first time since he had walked out to the lobby 40 minutes ago, Alastair saw something in the principal's eyes that was not calculation or performance or the careful management of competing interests. It was the look of a man choosing a side. Richard, Hargrove said into the phone. We need to talk about your son. A pause. No. Not later. Now. He did not look away from Alastair as he said it. And outside, somewhere in the hallway beyond the office door, a sound carried through the gap at the bottom. Footsteps moving fast, with the particular urgent rhythm of someone who had just received news and was trying to get somewhere before the consequences did. Alastair recognized the rhythm. It was the sound of someone who had just run out of time. The assembly was Preston's idea. That was the first thing Alastair noted when Hargrove relayed the Montgomery family's proposed resolution. A voluntary public apology, student-led, demonstrating accountability and character. Richard Montgomery had suggested it within 30 seconds of Hargrove's call, which meant he had prepared it before the call came, which meant he understood the situation well enough to have already begun managing it. Alastair had agreed. He had agreed so quickly, so easily, that Hargrove had looked at him with the expression of a man who suspects the ground beneath him has changed composition but cannot yet identify exactly how. That was fine. He would understand soon enough. The auditorium at Westbrook Academy seated 400. By 2:45, it held 312 students, 11 faculty members, 4 administrative staff, and 2 parents. Richard Montgomery in the front row, jacket pressed, expression composed into the particular blankness of a man performing calm he does not feel, and Hargrove beside him, who had aged, Alastair thought, approximately 4 years since this morning. Alastair stood at the back. He had entered through the rear door quietly after the room had filled. He had not announced himself. He had simply taken a position against the back wall, folder under his arm, and waited with the stillness that was, by now, the most unsettling thing about him. The quality of a man who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to be here. A few students near the back noticed him. They looked at the silver-haired man in the dark suit who was not a teacher and not a parent anyone recognized, and then they looked at each other, and then they looked forward again, because the stage was being approached. Preston walked out to a microphone. He looked, Alastair thought, extraordinary. That was the word. Not handsome, not confident, though he was both, but extraordinary in the way of someone who had been told their whole life that they were the protagonist of every room they entered and had simply, completely believed it. He walked to the microphone with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this and was pleased with the rehearsal. His jacket was perfect. His expression calibrated to precisely the right frequency of sincere remorse. He cleared his throat. I want to start by saying that this morning I said something that was unkind. His voice carried well. Practiced. The word unkind doing the specific work of a word chosen carefully to minimize while appearing to confront. I made a comment about a fellow student that was out of line, and I want to publicly apologize for that. He paused. Let the pause breathe. Alastair watched the room respond to him. The slight relaxation in the faculty seats, the few students nodding, the general collective exhale of an audience that wants to believe a thing is over because the alternative requires more from them. Claire, Preston said, finding her in the crowd with practiced precision, making eye contact with the rehearsed openness of a boy who had been coached. I'm sorry. Genuinely. The room was quiet. Receptive. Somewhere in the front row, Richard Montgomery's shoulders dropped a fraction. The release of a man who believes the machinery he set in motion is working. Then the rear doors opened. Not dramatically. They simply opened, the way doors open when someone pushes them, and a thin bar of afternoon light cut briefly across the back of the auditorium before the doors settled closed again. But the sound moved through the room the way sounds move in spaces where people are paying close attention. Felt before it was understood, registered in the body before the mind caught up. Preston's eyes found the back of the room. His mouth stayed open for a fraction of a second too long. Then he stepped back from the microphone. Alastair walked to the front. He did not hurry. He moved through the room the way he moved through every room, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already done the math and knows how it resolves. Students turned in their seats as he passed. Faculty exchanged glances. Hargrove on the front row looked at his hands. Alastair reached the microphone. He did not introduce himself. He opened the folder. I'll be brief, he said. And then he began to read. Not the summary page. He set that aside. He read from page 2. The architecture page. The one that mapped, in clean factual language, the precise relationship between Montgomery Capital and Sterling Industries. He read company names, contract values, renewal dates, the the specific quarterly disbursements that represented, in aggregate, the financial foundation upon which the Montgomery family's current lifestyle was constructed. He read it the way you read a weather report. Informational. Unhurried. The room did not understand it immediately. Understanding moved through the auditorium in stages. First the faculty, then the sharper students, then the rest, a slow tide of comprehension rising from the front rows backward as the numbers accumulated and the picture they assembled became, unavoidably, clear. Preston stood to the side of the stage. His face had done something that Alastair suspected it had never done in a room full of people before. It had gone blank. Not composed. Not performing. Simply blank. The expression of someone whose internal architecture has encountered something it was not built to process. Richard Montgomery, in the front row, had stopped performing calm entirely. He was gray. Not pale gray, the specific colorlessness of a man who has just watched something he believed was secured become, in the space of 4 minutes of quiet recitation, entirely unsecured. His hands, Alastair noticed, were flat on his knees, pressing down. The physical effort of a man trying to keep himself in his seat. Alastair reached the final page. He looked up from the folder for the first time. The auditorium was absolutely silent. Not the silence of an audience waiting for what comes next, but the silence of a room that has collectively stopped breathing. Preston's apology, Alastair said, was beautifully delivered. He closed the folder. I'd like my daughter to stand up. Every head in the room turned to find Claire Sterling, still in the corner she'd been directed to, still holding herself with the contained stillness of someone who has survived the morning by sheer force of will. She stood. Slowly. Backpack on the chair beside her. Worn canvas, fraying straps. Alastair looked at her across the length of the auditorium. Something moved across his face that was not the expression of a man with a folder and a point to make. It was older than that. Quieter. Claire had spent the assembly counting exits. It was an old habit, the kind you develop when you've been the subject of enough rooms to understand that knowing where the doors are is the difference between leaving on your terms and being trapped in someone else's narrative. There were 4 exits in the Westbrook Auditorium. 2 at the rear, 1 stage left, 1 behind the faculty seating that required a keycard. She had identified all 4 in the first 90 seconds after sitting down, before Preston had even approached the microphone. She had needed something to do with her mind that wasn't feeling. She had watched his apology with the detached precision of someone reviewing footage. She noted the word unkind. She noted the calibrated pause. She noted the way he found her in the crowd. Practiced, theatrical, making the audience witness his sincerity, and she felt the familiar closing down sensation of being looked at by a room that hadn't yet decided whether she was a person or a plot point. She had kept her face still. She had kept her hands in her lap. She had breathed. And then the rear doors had opened. She had known it was him before she saw him. Not from the sound, though the quality of the room's silence changed the moment he entered, the way air pressure changes before weather. She had known because of something older and less rational than observation. Some frequency that had been established in childhood and never fully gone quiet, even across 4 schools and 7 years and the long-managed distance she had constructed between herself and the fact that she missed her father with a constancy that embarrassed her. She had watched him walk to the front. She had watched him open the folder. And she had watched Richard Montgomery's face go gray in the front row, and Preston's face go blank on the stage, and the room hold its breath in the specific way rooms hold their breath when they understand that what they are witnessing is not the performance that was advertised. She had not felt triumphant. That surprised her, faintly, the absence of triumph. She had expected something sharp and satisfying, the particular relief of a scale tipping finally, visibly, in the right direction. But what she felt instead was quieter than that and more complicated. It was something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you've forgotten it isn't part of your body. And then her father had looked across the length of the auditorium and said, "You don't have to be small here." She had lifted her chin. Not triumphant. Not performing dignity for the room. Simply resolving something. Deciding something. The internal shift of a girl who has spent 4 schools making herself invisible coming to the end of that particular strategy. Not because it failed, but because she was tired of needing it. The room could see her. It could know her name. She was Claire Sterling, and her father was standing at the front of the auditorium with a folder and a stillness that had just rearranged the power structure of an entire institution, and she was allowed to exist at full size. She stood when he asked her to. She did not look at Preston. She did not look at Richard Montgomery. She looked at her father, and she stayed standing until he nodded, and then she sat back down, and she put her hand on her backpack, the worn canvas, the fraying straps, the bag that had been a system and a shield and a small, careful lie, and held it. The room emptied slowly. Faculty shepherding students, the administrative machinery of aftermath engaging. Forms to be filed, statements to be taken, the institutional processing of an event that no one had a protocol for because no one had imagined it. Richard Montgomery left without speaking to anyone, which was, Claire thought, the loudest thing he had done all day. Preston was escorted out through the stage door by a vice principal whose expression suggested she had aged significantly since morning. Hargrove lingered near the exit, speaking quietly into his phone. And then, gradually, the auditorium became what it actually was. A large, slightly worn room with bad acoustics and 400 empty seats and 2 people standing at opposite ends of it. Alistair walked toward her. He moved the same way he always had, unhurried, certain, the walk of someone who has decided where they are going and sees no reason to negotiate with the distance. She watched him come and did not move. The way you stay still when something you have stopped expecting turns out to be real and you are afraid that moving will break it. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. Not the room, not the folder, not the strategic landscape of the afternoon. Her. With the specific, undivided quality of attention that she had spent 2 years telling herself she didn't need. He said, "You called." 2 words. Carrying everything that 2 words could carry. The surprise of it, the weight of the years that had made it surprising, and underneath both of those things, in the register that she heard more clearly than the words themselves, something that sounded like, "I didn't know you still would." She looked at him. "You came," she said. And that was everything too. Not an accusation about the times he hadn't. Not a performance of forgiveness. Simply the acknowledgement of a fact that was, in this moment, the most important fact in the room. He sat down beside her. Not across from her, beside her. In the adjacent seat, the way you sit next to someone when you are done with the geometry of distance. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the auditorium, the school was resuming its ordinary sounds. Footsteps, doors, the distant bell marking the end of a period. The world was continuing its business, as it always did, indifferent to the private earthquakes of the people moving through it. "I owe you," he began. "Not now," she said. He stopped, looked at her, and she saw something move across his face that she had not seen in so long she had to locate the memory of it from somewhere very far back. A softening around the eyes, the specific expression of a man who has been carefully armored for years encountering something his armor was not designed to deflect. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "Not now." She looked down at the backpack in her hands. Turned it over once. "I'm going to need a new bag," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you are." They sat there in the empty auditorium, father and daughter, in the specific silence of 2 people who have a great deal to say to each other and have just agreed, wordlessly, to begin. And then Claire's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Preston Montgomery's absence was announced on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. There was no assembly, no formal address, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. His name simply stopped appearing on the class register, the way names sometimes stop appearing at schools like Westbrook, quietly and without official explanation, leaving a vacancy that the institution moved swiftly to fill with rearranged seating charts and updated group project rosters. By Thursday, his chair in the third row had been claimed by a girl named Simone who had been waiting 18 months for that particular seat and its particular sightline to the window. By Friday, the official story, to the extent that there was one, was that Preston had transferred to an institution better suited to his needs. No one said which institution. No one asked. The unofficial story was more specific, more interesting, and more true. It moved through Westbrook the way all real information moved, sideways in hallways, in the particular hushed register of people sharing something they understand is significant. It involved a board meeting that had lasted 4 hours, a development committee emergency session, the quiet, permanent restructuring of several financial arrangements that had, it turned out, been holding certain understandings in place for longer than anyone had officially acknowledged. Richard Montgomery had not attended the board meeting in person. He had sent a lawyer. The lawyer had left after 90 minutes without speaking to anyone on the way out. And somewhere in the machinery of all this, in the boardrooms and the legal correspondence and the careful, bloodless language of institutional accountability, Preston had been transferred, his father's name had been removed from 2 committees, and Westbrook Academy had updated its student conduct policy for the first time in 7 years. None of this was announced. All of it was known. 1 month later, Claire Sterling walked into first period English and took her seat in the back row. She still arrived with the worn backpack. She had considered replacing it. Her father had mentioned it again, once, over dinner in the second week, pushing a catalog across the table with the particular awkward generosity of a man relearning how to do small things. She had looked at the catalog. She had thought about it for 2 days. She had kept the bag. Not as a system anymore. Not as camouflage or strategy or the careful performance of belonging nowhere. She kept it because it was hers, because she had chosen it, and because she had decided somewhere in the month since the auditorium that she was done organizing her appearance around other people's assumptions. The bag was worn. She was aware of that. She was no longer interested in what that information did to other people's assessments of her. The room had changed around her in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. It wasn't fear. She had been in rooms that operated on fear, and she knew its particular quality, the way it made people perform enthusiasm at you with slightly too much energy, the way it made laughter arrive a half-second early. This wasn't that. And it wasn't pity, which had its own distinct flavor, the particular tenderness of people who have decided you are fragile and are being careful around you. This was something quieter and more durable. When she came into a room, people moved without being asked. Not dramatically, not performatively, just the small, ordinary adjustments of a space-making room. When she spoke in class, which was happening more often now, the room listened with the specific quality of attention you give to someone whose observations have proven, reliably, to be worth hearing. When she sat in the cafeteria, still at her corner table, still with her coffee, people occasionally sat nearby without it being an event. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like respect. Not the respect of her father's name. Not the respect of fear or proximity to power. The specific, unremarkable, quietly precious respect of a room that has simply decided that a person belongs in it. She was still learning how to receive it. Mr. Calloway noticed. He noticed most things, and he had been watching Claire Sterling with the quiet attention of a man who understood that what had happened in his classroom a month ago, the moment he had moved 1 second too late, had changed something in him professionally in ways he was still processing. He was more present now. More willing to occupy the discomfort of intervention. He had arrived 1 second too late once. He did not intend to make it a habit. He saw the way the room had reorganized around her, and he recognized it for what it was. After class, he stopped her at the door. "Sterling," he said, "you're writing for the school paper." She looked at him. That wasn't a question. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She almost smiled. Almost. She walked out into the hallway, which parted for her slightly naturally, the way hallways part for people who have stopped trying to disappear, and shifted her worn backpack on her shoulders and thought, for the first time in 4 schools and 7 years, that she might stay. That this place might be worth it. She was thinking this, holding it carefully, the way you hold something you're not yet ready to trust, when her phone buzzed. Her father. She picked up immediately now. That was new. That was one of the things the month had changed. "Dinner tonight," he said. Not a question either. She was beginning to understand this was a family trait. "Yes," she said. A pause. The comfortable kind, the kind that had taken them 3 weeks to learn and that she was still faintly amazed by, that silence with her father could be comfortable at all. Then, "There's something I need to tell you." His voice had shifted. The slight roughness of it, the quality she had learned to read in the month of dinners and phone calls and the careful daily reconstruction of a relationship that had nearly become a ruin, it had gone very still. The way it went still when something mattered. She stopped walking. Around her, the hallway moved. Students, noise, the ordinary current of a school day. She stood in the middle of it like a stone in a stream. "What is it?" she said. Another pause. Shorter this time. "Richard Montgomery filed suit this morning," he said. "Against the school. Against the board. A beat. And against me." The hallway noise continued around her. Indifferent and bright. "His lawyers are saying the assembly was coercion."